Now let me ask you this. What if everything you thought you knew about success was wrong? Clint Eastwood, a man who's seen it all, suddenly finds himself face to face with someone from his past who shows him that true greatness isn't measured by fame or fortune. In a shocking turn of events, Clint's life takes a surprising twist, leading him to discover the one thing he's been missing all along. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stick around till the end. You won't want to miss how this unforgettable encounter changes everything. Before we dive into today's story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like this video and hit subscribe so you never miss a story. Clint Eastwood stepped into the small bookstore, the familiar scent of old paper and polished wood filling his senses. It was a quiet afternoon, one of those rare moments when the world felt still, the kind Clint cherished amidst his bustling schedule. His mind wandered, as it always did in the rare moments of solitude, meeting agents, checking emails, handling business. It was all routine, almost mechanical. But as the door shut behind him, something in the air shifted. The steady rhythm of his thoughts faltered, and he looked up. There she was, behind the counter, busy organizing books with a grace that seemed timeless. At first, he couldn't place her. It was a fleeting moment of confusion, a blur of recognition that didn't quite make sense. The wrinkles on her face, the way her glasses sat perched just at the edge of her nose, all seemed so familiar, yet out of reach. And then, like a sudden gust of wind cutting through fog, it hit him. Mrs. Jennings, his childhood teacher, the woman who had been a quiet force in his young life, always patient, always hopeful, even when no one else saw potential in him. The realization came like a jolt, a flash of memories, his small hands gripping a pencil, his awkward posture in class, and her steady voice encouraging him when he doubted himself. She had been his guiding light, the one who saw something in him that even he didn't know was there. Clint hadn't seen her in decades. The last time he did, he was a young boy, unsure of his future and unaware of the profound impact she would have on his life. After high school, life took him down a different path, away from her influence, away from the quiet classroom, into a world of fame and fortune. But here she was still standing, still working, at 85, alive, vibrant, and active as ever. His heart skipped a beat. The sight of her stirred something deep inside him, something that went beyond nostalgia. She hadn't changed. She was the same person who, all those years ago, took the time to teach him that dreams were possible, even for a kid from a broken home. As he stood there in the doorway, frozen for a moment, uncertainty washed over him. Should he approach her? What would he say after all these years? Would she even recognize him? Or had time been too kind to him and too unforgiving to her? But there she was, her eyes sparkling with the same warmth he remembered, as if no time had passed at all. She was moving from shelf to shelf, chatting with customers and arranging the latest books with the same diligence and care that defined her. It was almost as if she hadn't aged a day, her energy unchanged, her purpose unwavering. Clint couldn't help but feel small in that moment. She had lived her life with purpose, making an impact in ways that Clint, for all his fame, could never truly understand. There was something profoundly humbling about it. His success, his fame, they seemed insignificant in the face of this woman's quiet, enduring spirit. He took a step forward, unsure of what to do next, but compelled by something much stronger than curiosity. Was this woman, who had guided him all those years ago, still carrying the same fire within her? Could it still burn as bright as it had back then? He had to find out. It wasn't just a reunion. It was a reckoning, a collision of past and present that would change the way Clint viewed everything. Clint's steps were hesitant at first, his heart racing slightly as he approached the counter. The familiar bell above the door jingled softly, and Mrs. Jennings looked up, her eyes widening with recognition. Her smile appeared almost instinctively, the same smile that had once reassured him on difficult days in the classroom, and the same smile that now made him pause. "Well, if it isn't Clint Eastwood," she said, her voice warm, filled with that blend of kindness and quiet amusement he remembered so well. "I didn't expect to see you in a place like this." Clint chuckled, running a hand through his hair, trying to suppress the mix of emotions bubbling inside him. "I didn't expect to see you here either. Still teaching the world through books." "Teaching never really stops," she said with a shrug, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "You know that, Clint. It's not just a job, it's a calling. But I suppose I'm still doing my part. Clint felt a pang of guilt as he took in her appearance, her thin but steady hands arranging books, the care with which she straightened each spine as if it were an art form. He realized, not for the first time, that Mrs. Jennings had always seen value in the things that others overlooked, whether it was a book gathering dust or a student unsure of their own potential. The world had gone on changing, evolving, while she remained rooted in her simple, purposeful life. As they talked, Clint felt like a stranger in his own skin. The years of fame, the endless accolades, the expensive suits, it all seemed like an armor now, one that weighed him down more than he realized. Mrs. Jennings, on the other hand, wore nothing but the years that had added a quiet wisdom to her character. Time had not taken away her energy or her passion, it had only deepened it. "You were always the one who believed in me," Clint said, his voice quieter now, a rare vulnerability creeping in. "When no one else did. I remember, when I didn't know what I wanted, you always told me to dream big. Even when I didn't think it was possible." Mrs. Jennings tilted her head, as if considering his words carefully, and then smiled, that same knowing smile. "You were always capable of more than you knew, Clint. You just had to believe it yourself." She paused for a moment, her gaze turning soft, as if reflecting on their shared history. "I didn't have to know what you were capable of. I just had to remind you." Clint's throat tightened. He had never realized how much those small words of encouragement had meant to him back then. To him, they were just passing moments in a classroom, but for Mrs. Jennings, they were her way of sowing hope, of teaching her students to see beyond their current limitations. She had been teaching long before anyone thought to make it a career. It was her calling. As the conversation drifted back into the present, Clint's mind wandered. He found himself lost in the memories of that classroom, the chalk dust in the air, the worn-out textbooks, and the smell of fresh coffee Mrs. Jennings had always brewed in the back room for her students after school. In his mind's eye, he could see her, in her worn cardigan, sitting at her desk, jotting down notes, her eyes never straying too far from her students. Always observant, always present. The connection between them wasn't just a teacher and student bond. It had always been something deeper, something Clint had never fully grasped until now. She had guided him, nurtured him when others had given up, and though he had forgotten much of it over the years, she had never let go of that belief in him. "I've wondered about you over the years," Clint said, his voice tinged with a sense of reflection. "Where you went, what you were doing. I guess I never thought to come back and check in." "You were busy making a name for yourself," Mrs. Jennings said with a soft chuckle, her tone light, but there was something deeper there. "And that's good. That's what I always wanted for you, success. Not fame or money, but to find something that fulfilled you." "I think I found it," Clint said, his voice quiet. There was a certain weight in his words, as if he was trying to convince himself more than her. His life had taken him down a path that had made him everything he had ever dreamed of and more. He had everything, except for the one thing that mattered more than all the accolades. Fulfillment. Mrs. Jennings studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to read between the lines of his words. "Did you?" she asked, with a quiet wisdom that felt like a challenge. Clint's chest tightened. She had always known how to cut through the noise, how to make him confront the parts of himself he tried to ignore. She wasn't just his teacher, she was his mirror, reflecting back the truths he wasn't ready to face. As the conversation lingered on, the weight of the years settled between them, not as something burdensome, but as something that had only strengthened their connection. The years had passed, but the lessons had stayed with him, hidden in the quiet moments, in the times he needed guidance but didn't know where to look. For the first time in a long while, Clint felt like the young boy again, unsure of his place in the world, but certain of one thing: he was here for a reason. And Mrs. Jennings? She was still teaching him, just by being the same person she had always been. "Maybe," Clint said finally, "I still need a little more reminding." Mrs. Jennings smiled, as if she'd heard it all before. "We all do, Clint. We all do." Clint left the bookstore that afternoon feeling unsettled. He had expected a simple reunion, perhaps a few warm words exchanged over coffee. But something deeper had stirred within him, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. Mrs. Jennings, with her quiet dignity, her unwavering belief in hard work and purpose, had sparked a question in him that refused to be answered. Had his success truly been worth it? The following day, he returned to the bookstore. This time, he walked with purpose, his mind racing with thoughts of how he could fix the situation. He had been thinking about Mrs. Jennings' life, how she had dedicated herself to teaching for so many years, how she was still working at 85, and how, despite all his accomplishments, he felt like he was missing something. Clint had it all, or so it seemed. He had money, fame, adoration from fans. Yet, Mrs. Jennings had something he didn't, something he'd never been able to fully grasp: purpose. She worked not for recognition or financial reward, but for the satisfaction of making a difference. Every book she shelved, every student she encouraged, was a step toward something more meaningful. Clint had spent his life in pursuit of his own dream, achieving things that most could only imagine. Yet, he realized he had often focused on the wrong kind of success. For a moment, he felt like an imposter in his own skin, questioning his every choice, wondering if all the accolades were just hollow victories. As he walked into the bookstore, Mrs. Jennings was behind the counter once more, sorting through a stack of new arrivals. This time, Clint had a plan. He approached her slowly, his heart pounding. He was going to make things right. He would use his wealth, his success, to give her what he thought she deserved. He would fix her life the way he thought it needed fixing, by offering comfort, luxury, and freedom from the daily grind. "Mrs. Jennings," Clint began, his voice steady but his heart racing, "I've been thinking a lot since yesterday. You've given so much to others over the years, more than anyone could ever repay. I think it's time someone did something for you." She looked up at him, her brow furrowed slightly, sensing the shift in his tone. Clint didn't wait for her to respond. "I want to help you retire," he continued. "You've spent your whole life giving. It's time you enjoyed the fruits of your labor. I can set you up with everything you need: money, a house, whatever you want. You shouldn't be working at this age. Let me help you live the life you deserve." The words felt right as they left his lips, and yet there was a strange sense of discomfort that crept in. This wasn't how he had imagined it. He had always thought that offering someone wealth was the solution to their problems, but here, in the face of someone who didn't ask for anything, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Mrs. Jennings stood silent for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Her eyes, sharp and wise, met his. And then, to Clint's surprise, she shook her head slowly, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Clint," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I appreciate the thought. I do. But you're missing the point." Clint blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected this. "What do you mean?" "You've been working your whole life. You deserve a break." "I don't need a break," she replied, her eyes never leaving his. "I need to continue doing what I love. I need to help others, to teach, to give. And no amount of money can change that. What I need is not wealth, it's purpose. And I've found that, right here, in these books and in the people I meet every day." Clint was stunned. He hadn't expected such a response, and for a moment, his own feelings of uncertainty began to bubble up. He had been so sure of his actions. He thought money and comfort were the solutions. He had seen his success as a way to fix everything for others. But in that moment, Mrs. Jennings had proven him wrong. She wasn't interested in material comfort or a life of leisure. She didn't want a retirement package or a luxurious home. She didn't need Clint's version of success. What she valued, what she had always valued, was the work itself. The giving of herself, the making of an impact on others. Her success wasn't measured by possessions. It was measured by the lives she touched, the difference she made in the world, even in the smallest ways. Clint's chest tightened, the weight of her words sinking in. He had lived his life by the standard of achievement, of wealth, of fame. But now, standing before Mrs. Jennings, he began to question the very foundation of his existence. Had his life been defined by the right things? Or had he, too, become lost in the illusion of success, measuring his worth by what he owned rather than what he gave? "I never thought about it like that," Clint said, his voice low, filled with realization. "I've been so focused on what I have, that I never stopped to think about why I have it." Mrs. Jennings smiled gently, her eyes softening. "That's the thing, Clint. Success isn't about what you can buy or what you can show off. It's about what you give to the world and how you make it better. You've already had a chance to do that, whether you realize it or not." Clint stood in stunned silence. He had thought he could offer Mrs. Jennings a solution. But she had, in fact, given him the answer to the very question he'd been running from his whole life. Purpose was more valuable than anything money could buy. And in that moment, Clint realized something profound. He had been looking for purpose in all the wrong places. Clint left the bookstore that afternoon feeling like a man in the middle of a storm. His usual confidence, the solid foundation of his success, felt suddenly flimsy, like it was built on sand rather than rock. As he stepped into his car, the engine's hum seemed quieter, the world outside sharper. He couldn't shake the conversation with Mrs. Jennings from his mind. Everything he thought he knew about success, everything he had worked so hard to achieve, suddenly seemed irrelevant. He had spent decades building an empire, cultivating a career that made him a household name, earning praise, wealth, and recognition. But now, sitting in his car, he couldn't help but wonder, had he been living a lie? He had always believed that the key to happiness was more money, more fame, more success. He'd made it his life's mission to get as much as he could, to fill a void that he couldn't even name. But now, standing face to face with Mrs. Jennings, who had nothing but her purpose and a quiet life, Clint had begun to question everything. What had he sacrificed in pursuit of all this? Did he even want all of it? That night, Clint couldn't sleep. His mind churned with questions, none of which had clear answers. He had worked so hard to get to where he was. Hadn't he earned the right to enjoy it? But Mrs. Jennings' words echoed in his mind, pushing him to look deeper, to ask himself what mattered more, the size of his bank account or the depth of his heart. The next morning, Clint decided to do something radical. He would take a break from everything. The meetings, the calls, the constant whirlwind of business. He needed space to think, space to rediscover the purpose he had lost somewhere along the way. He needed to step back and reflect, just as Mrs. Jennings had done all her life. He returned to the bookstore later that day, not with an agenda, but with a sense of humility that he hadn't felt in years. The bookstore, with its familiar scent and quiet atmosphere, felt like a refuge, somewhere simple, where the noise of the world couldn't reach him. He walked in slowly, the bell above the door chiming softly, as though announcing his arrival to a space that had always been unchanged by the tides of his career. Mrs. Jennings was there again, her face lighting up as she saw him. "Clint," she said, her voice warm, as if nothing had changed. "Back again, I see. What brings you this time?" Clint smiled softly, though there was a hint of something deeper in his eyes. "I've been thinking," he began, taking a deep breath, "about what you said. You were right. I've been chasing the wrong things for so long. I thought I could buy purpose, buy fulfillment. But it doesn't work that way, does it?" Mrs. Jennings regarded him silently for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded slowly. "No, Clint. It doesn't. Purpose isn't something you find in things. It's something you find in what you do with the time you have, the lives you touch, the impact you make." Clint sat down across from her, feeling a strange sense of peace, as though he were in the right place at the right time. "I've been so focused on achieving greatness in the world," he said quietly, "that I lost sight of what it really means to be great." She smiled, a gentle smile that held no judgment, only understanding. "Greatness doesn't always come in the form of fame or wealth, Clint. It comes in the quiet acts of kindness, the sacrifices you make for others, the time you spend helping someone else see the world differently." Clint thought about that for a long time, watching as she sorted through books without hurry, each movement graceful and intentional. There was no rush in her life, no frantic pace to get to the next big thing. She worked with purpose because she loved what she did, and it was enough. He realized that, in her quiet way, she had always been more successful than he could ever hope to be. "I've spent so much of my life trying to fill an emptiness I didn't understand," Clint continued, his voice thick with emotion. "And now I see that the emptiness isn't about money or fame. It's about being present, being part of something bigger than yourself." Mrs. Jennings nodded once again. "That's the first step, Clint. And you're on the right path. It's not about what you have, it's about what you give, how you live, and what legacy you leave behind." Clint sat in silence, absorbing her words. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was hearing the truth, not through the lens of his own ambition or ego, but from someone who had lived a life of meaning. A life that was quietly profound, even if the world never noticed. For the next few hours, Clint stayed in the bookstore, talking with Mrs. Jennings about books, about life, about what it meant to truly give back. They discussed everything and nothing, their conversation flowing naturally as though time had no power over them. It felt good, for once, to just be, without the weight of expectations or the pressure of success hanging over him. As Clint left the bookstore that day, he felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He wasn't sure what the next steps would be, but he knew one thing: he would no longer chase empty goals. He would no longer define his worth by what he had or how much he had achieved. He would redefine success, not by fame or fortune, but by the difference he could make in the world. And as he walked away, he felt lighter than he had in years. He didn't know where this new path would lead him, but for the first time in a long while, he was excited to find out. The days that followed were quieter for Clint. The rush of meetings, the endless calls, the constant media attention, they all seemed distant now. For the first time in years, Clint felt like he was living in the present, not just moving through it. He spent more time reflecting, more time thinking about what Mrs. Jennings had shown him. Her words had struck deep, planting seeds that had begun to grow. He began to question the very core of his life's work. Yes, he had achieved incredible things, but they had been for the wrong reasons. All his success had been in pursuit of recognition, fame, and wealth, things that, in the end, left him hollow. The lessons he had learned from Mrs. Jennings about purpose, giving back, and truly making a difference were now the driving forces in his mind. But Clint knew that words alone would not be enough. He couldn't simply go on living the way he had before. Something had to change, and it had to start with action. He needed to honor Mrs. Jennings, not just as his teacher, but as someone who had unknowingly led him to a much greater truth. He needed to show her that her belief in him, her guidance, had made a lasting impact. And so, Clint decided to take a bold step. He knew that Mrs. Jennings didn't want the luxuries he had offered before. She didn't want money or fame. She wanted something more meaningful, something that truly acknowledged her life's work. The idea came to him as he sat quietly one evening, reflecting on their conversations. What better way to honor her than by giving back in a way that mirrored the essence of her own life? He would create something that would not only celebrate her impact, but would help carry her legacy forward. Clint reached out to a local university with a proposal. He wanted to establish a scholarship in Mrs. Jennings' name, a scholarship for students who wanted to become educators, who had the same quiet passion for teaching that she did. The scholarship would provide not just financial support, but mentorship and resources to help these future educators develop their skills and inspire the next generation, just as she had inspired him. As he finalized the details, Clint also began planning a small ceremony to announce the scholarship. It wasn't going to be a grand spectacle. There would be no media, no flashing lights. This was about honoring Mrs. Jennings in a way that aligned with her values, quiet, meaningful, and purposeful. He wanted her to know that her work had never been forgotten and that her lessons would continue, shaping the lives of young people for years to come. When the day of the ceremony arrived, Clint invited a few close friends and colleagues, along with the students who had benefited from the scholarship program. He asked Mrs. Jennings to join him, though he kept the details of the event a secret from her. He wanted her to be surprised, to feel the full weight of the gesture. The small bookstore was filled with warmth as everyone gathered. Clint stood at the front, surrounded by the quiet, attentive faces of those who were there to celebrate. Mrs. Jennings arrived, looking as composed and graceful as ever, though her eyes flickered with curiosity. Clint began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm here today to honor someone who has meant more to me than I can express. Someone who, without ever knowing it, changed the course of my life. Mrs. Jennings has been more than a teacher to me. She has been a guiding light. She showed me that true success is not measured by wealth or fame, but by the difference we make in the lives of others." He paused for a moment, letting his words settle. The room was still, the only sound the faint rustling of paper and the soft clinking of glasses. Clint turned to Mrs. Jennings, who stood in front of him, her face a mixture of surprise and quiet pride. "I've learned more from you than I can ever repay," Clint continued, his voice thick with gratitude. "But today I hope to start. I've created a scholarship in your name, one that will help future educators, those who, like you, dedicate their lives to shaping young minds. The scholarship will carry your legacy, and it will ensure that your impact lives on for years to come." Mrs. Jennings blinked, her eyes welling with tears as she took in the news. She had never expected anything like this. Clint had given her more than she had ever dreamed of. She wasn't interested in accolades, in public recognition. But this was different. This was a gift that embodied everything she had stood for, a way to pass on the knowledge, the belief in others, and the quiet strength she had always embodied. She stepped forward, her voice shaky but full of warmth. "Clint," she said softly, "this is more than I could ever have imagined. You've always had such potential. I'm just glad that I was there to help you see it. But this is something else. You've taken what I taught you and turned it into something beautiful. I can't tell you how much this means to me." Clint smiled, a genuine smile, full of peace and satisfaction. "It's the least I could do, Mrs. Jennings. You gave me everything I needed, without even knowing it. I'm just finally understanding how much that really means." As the ceremony continued, Clint felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known. It wasn't the applause or the recognition he had grown accustomed to. It was something deeper. It was the feeling of knowing he had done something real, something that would make a difference in the lives of others. By the end of the day, Clint had come to understand the truth of what Mrs. Jennings had taught him all those years ago. True success is not measured by what we have, but by what we give. And through this scholarship, he had given something meaningful, something that would keep giving for generations to come. The weeks that followed the scholarship announcement felt like a new chapter in Clint's life. He continued to reflect on everything Mrs. Jennings had shown him. The weight of the lessons she had imparted was settling deeper, and he began to approach his life and career with a renewed sense of purpose. It was like a fog had lifted, and for the first time in a long while, Clint could see the road ahead clearly. He found himself back in the bookstore more often, not just to visit Mrs. Jennings, but to reconnect with the space where so much of his personal transformation had taken place. The smell of old paper and the sound of pages turning had become his solace. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound lessons came from the most unexpected places. One afternoon, he sat in the corner of the bookstore with a book in his hand, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the young students who would benefit from the scholarship, the lives that would be touched because of the small, humble act that had come from a place of deep reflection. He thought about the teachers, the quiet heroes who shaped the future without ever asking for recognition. Mrs. Jennings had given him a glimpse into that world, a world where greatness wasn't measured by the loudest applause, but by the quiet, steady work of those who believed in others. As Clint looked out the window, he couldn't help but smile. He realized that, despite all the awards, the money, the recognition, there was a peace that came from giving, truly giving, without expecting anything in return. Mrs. Jennings had shown him that, and through the scholarship, he had found a way to give something back, something that would outlast any trophy, any paycheck, any film project. That evening, Clint invited Mrs. Jennings to dinner. The two of them sat across from each other in a quiet restaurant, the low hum of conversation in the background as they sipped their drinks. It felt almost surreal to Clint, this moment where everything had come full circle. He was no longer the young, unsure boy who had walked into her classroom. Now he was a man who had learned to value the things that truly mattered. "Clint," Mrs. Jennings said, looking across the table at him, "I've been meaning to ask. What made you do this? What made you decide to create a scholarship in my name?" Clint smiled, his eyes softening with a quiet understanding. "I think it was the realization that I've spent my life chasing the wrong things," he said, pausing for a moment. "I thought that success was about fame and wealth, but the truth is, it's about the impact we make. You've always understood that, and I finally started to see it." Mrs. Jennings looked at him thoughtfully, her eyes glistening with pride. "You've always had that potential, Clint. But it's not just about success. It's about the choices we make, how we decide to use our time, our talents, our lives. It's the difference we make in the lives of others." Clint nodded. He had always known that deep down, but it wasn't until now that he truly understood the depth of those words. "I don't think I could ever thank you enough for everything you've given me. The scholarship, it's a small way of showing my gratitude." "It's not small," Mrs. Jennings replied, her voice warm but firm. "It's exactly what I would have hoped for, something that lasts, something that gives others a chance to do what they love, just like I did. You've done more for me than you'll ever know, Clint. You've taken what I taught you and turned it into something beautiful." The conversation lingered into the evening, but Clint was no longer troubled by the questions that had once consumed him. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't seeking validation or external recognition. He was content in the knowledge that he had found a deeper meaning, a purpose that went beyond anything he could have imagined when he first walked into that bookstore all those weeks ago. As he left the restaurant later that night, walking alongside Mrs. Jennings, Clint looked up at the stars above. He had come so far, from a young boy uncertain of his future, to a man who had seen the true measure of success. And the journey wasn't over. But for the first time, Clint felt at peace. He no longer needed to chase the world's approval. He had found something better, something that couldn't be measured by fame or fortune. He had found the quiet fulfillment of knowing that the impact he made on others was the true legacy he would leave behind.